Museums. Welcome to History is Lunch. We're glad to have you here with us as always. I'm Katie Blount, Director of the Department of Archives and History, and Chris Goodwin graciously allowed me to take his spot today so that I can welcome some very special guests. We have with us a group of executive leaders from Toyota. Y'all raise your hands. As you know, Toyota was a very early and very strong and generous partner to us in building the two museums. You walk under their name as you enter the Civil Rights Museum Gallery, and they regularly send groups of executives here to be with us, and I'm especially thrilled that they're here for History is Lunch today so that they can see how well we use the building that they helped us build. So again, thank me in welcoming and thanking them. Join me in welcoming them. I'm going to make a few quick announcements, and then I will introduce Megan Bankston, who will tell you about the program you're going to hear today. No History is Lunch next week. It's Thanksgiving week. The following week, author and professor Hassan Kwame Jeffries will present two programs for us, one at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, December 3rd in Port Gibson, focusing on the untold stories of enslavement at Windsor, and the second here for History is Lunch, December 4th, titled Misremembering the Past from Slavery to Civil Rights. Both programs are sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities through the Mississippi Humanities Council. Also, Possum Ridge, as every year, opens upstairs here on December 1st, and the Christmas by Candlelight tour will be December 6th. Thanks again for coming, and now I'm really pleased to introduce Megan Bankston, who is the project manager for the Vicksburg project that you're going to hear all about today. Megan.
Welcome. Thanks so much for coming today. My name is Megan Bankston. I'm the Vicksburg project manager here at MDAH, and I'm here to tell you about our wonderful Vicksburg project. So in the closing days of the 2023 legislative session, the Mississippi legislature directed MDAH to work with the Friends of the Vicksburg National Military Park and Campaign and the National Park Service at the Vicksburg National Military Park to construct a state-of-the-art visitor center and museum near the park. And we want to thank Bess Averett, Friends Executive Director, for her dedication and vision, which has been the driving force behind the state's commitment and involvement for this project. We also want to recognize Brigadier General Robert Creer, who is the Friends Board President, for his project leadership. And Mark Hoseman, member of the Friends Board, also joins us today. And they're all sitting over here, and so we want to thank them for their continued support of this project. So the legislature provided $10 million to launch the project and followed with another $6 million in 2024. The Vicksburg National Military Park was established in 1899 to commemorate and preserve the site of the battle and the siege. The park has more recently expanded to include important campaign sites in surrounding areas such as Port Gibson, Champion Hill, and Chickasaw Bayou. The Vicksburg Military Park is the most visited cultural site in the state of Mississippi. However, the Visitor Center, which opened in the 1960s, lacks the space for expansion. More than a single battle or a 47-day siege, the partners envision a new museum that tells the complete story of the Vicksburg Campaign. Interpretation will expand on existing narratives and diverse stories from soldiers, sailors, and civilians, both free and enslaved. The new center will contextualize the full story of Vicksburg and the legacy of the war. And it also promises to have a positive economic impact for the city, region, and state. The partners collaborate on decisions relating to the planning, designing, and constructing of a state-owned and operated museum near the park, and MDAH is thrilled to play a leading role in telling this monumental story of the Vicksburg Campaign. MDAH now owns approximately 12.5 acres adjacent to the park where the center will be built, and plans for the building and exhibits are well underway, and we anticipate opening in 2028. Today, I'm pleased to introduce representatives from the architecture and exhibit design firms here to share their concepts and project vision. Both are capturing our imaginations on how the history of the campaign and the terrain of Vicksburg can be told through architecture and interpretation. So first up, we'll hear from Zena Howard. She is the managing principal architect at Perkins&Will. And then we'll hear from James Lyde, who is the director of interpretation and content at G&A. So let me welcome Zena Howard to the stage.
Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm Zena Howard, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about our vision for the Interpretive Center, which is just at the beginning at this point. But I want to acknowledge my partners that are here today from Perkins&Will, Ralph Johnson, our lead architect designer, and Kristen, our wonderful project manager, and also my partner, Chris Garris, that works on museum planning and programming. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start today just talking a little bit about cultural projects. So our firm, we work from in diverse contexts and settings, anything from national landmark projects to really those rooted neighborhood projects, all the way to cultural landscapes and small monuments. So we're excited about this particular project as we thought about a concept for the design, and we really did many visits and were really inspired by, first, the story. You know, you can't underscore how important Grant's campaign was here, how important Vicksburg was to the war. And it was important mostly because of its iconic location along the Mississippi River, but also because of the topography and the terrain. So our visit here, obviously, you know, the ingenuity of Grant and his strategy, military strategy is important, but we also noted important things like the image you see at the bottom of the cypress trees and the swamp and how important that was to tactical war strategy. We also were inspired by the story. So this is really a story about the earth. So whereas topography played an importance in military strategy, it was also at the core of how the residents experienced these incidents that were going on. So we see where the residents fled, obviously underground. We were inspired by that. But we also see how the military used the earth and the topography and sort of dug in. So these two sort of planes of existence and experience really informed our concept that we call kind of inhabiting the earth. If you think about this beautiful site, the park site and the city and the river, it's really all about how the earth and structure and military strategy all meet each other. So we thought about our concept as being sort of a bridge, the building being a mediator between the man-made landscape that we have. This is like a conceptual, we call it as architects, section through the site. So if you think about on the far right side is the highway, the I-20 sort of view, and all the way on the far left side is the park. We thought about the building as being something that can mediate between that man-made environment of highway and that used to be, of course, as we know, a larger part of the national park, all the way to what is currently just the actual military park. So, and then there's a beautiful, on the site, there's a beautiful ravine between the two. So really thinking about that building, and the visitor journey is actually almost designed before you think about how you design a building. You really think about how one wants to experience this. So we were inspired. Our partners, which you're going to hear speak, James will speak right after me. Gallagher Associates are the exhibit designers on this project, and they had done an interpretive master plan, really looking at the major stories in these 5 categories that are going to be told. So we work closely with our exhibit design partners to say, the visitor journey through the building starts with the visitor journey through the content and the exhibits. So thinking about it, everything from pre-war Vicksburg all the way to Vicksburg today. And as you can see, where the part sort of tells a story that stops at the campaign and the siege, of course, as you heard from Megan, this facility will tell a larger story that embraces the occupation and aftermath, and certainly Vicksburg today. What we recognize about these stories is that they're not all dark and they're not all light. You know, there's sort of a blending of, you know, in times where there's war, there's peace. In times where there was fighting, there were people that were hunkering down. So we always look at these stories as a blending of the positive things that were happening in the midst of intense darkness. So this is what we call an experience diagram. This is not quite yet architecture. It's really thinking about how a visitor might interpret that site. So if you imagine, if we think about that concept diagram that I showed you, where the building is mediating between the man-made environment and the natural environment, we imagined an experience where the visitor would come in and move towards these, move into, you know, maybe from a porch or a lobby. We think a porch experience is really critical to the Southern experience. I'm from the South, and the porch is always a very important, a welcoming thing, something that's just so unique to the South. But coming into the building and entering into sort of a large, you know, gathering space, a central gathering space, and then going through these themes that I showed you that Gallagher had of the campaign, the siege, and the aftermath, actually sort of touring through in a space where it was really dark. The campaign and siege, some aspects of light, but as you roll through and come to the other side of occupation and aftermath, you start hitting areas where there's more natural light. This is sort of a conceptual interpretation of how a building would be viewed from Interstate 20, which is a main prominent view corridor. What's critical about this is that we want, while this is still undergoing design, of course, this interpretation shows that it should be a building that's stately, that's prominent, that uses regional materials, you know, that is of its place and of its time. We also thought this is a big center. It has to hold a lot of parking and a lot of activity in and out. Well, that parking should not be the most prominent thing that you see. So taking an approach to the site that focuses on, in the foreground, a rolling meadow, the natural aspects of the site, and then the building standing as a backdrop to that front meadow, all you know, sort of covering and masking the parking. Some sort of conceptual renderings of how those spaces that you saw in plan might work. So we call this the clearing. We have terms of endearment for these conceptual spaces. This would be maybe how a lobby would feel. Walking into that lobby, and we contrast that with the historical image of the cypress trees in the swamp that was so critical to Grant's campaign. So having that feeling, a more relevant contemporary interpretation of those trees and that clearing in the swamp, looking back towards the national park. And remember, I told you the darker spaces, the campaign and the siege, as you come around, you know, these times were very tumultuous, trauma, a lot of disunity. There was still also unity, and although the country, you know, shifted and bent in many ways, it never broke. And so you see this interpretation of how that feeling of the siege comes in, and you still have some light coming in above you. So now, as we turn the corner through occupation and aftermath, we also know this was a time where the country really wrestled with, you know, how to go forward, how to move forward, and there were many people that were suddenly no longer enslaved wrestling with this new thing called Reconstruction that in many ways was not successful, and in some areas it did have some success. So you see the dark and the light modulating between this uncertainty as you turn that corner and get that view, beautiful, clear view back to the national park. And then when we talk about Vicksburg today, and we look at, the treasures, the wonderful river, the mighty land, the beautiful topography, all the things that still exist, we're in full light, and we're in full context of that adjacent ravine. We're coming back out through that porch, that lobby that I showed you about, but we think that a porch, in our interpretation of how a porch might express itself on the site and hold those critical activities such as living history and the sort of reenactments that happen, and also the groups and the Soldier for a Day and all the programs that the school kids have, having a bowl covered area to do that is really important. And then the lawn. This is again where that living history can be experienced and people can really feel get a full breath of the site and the activity. And we also know that the Friends of Vicksburg they have a full program. A lot of it is an outdoor program that has to be housed on the site. And finally here, we could not resist putting the visitor into the earth in a different way. We know that most people tour the national park either via vehicular or pedestrian method, but putting them down in that ravine, telling the story, other stories, not necessarily the war and battle stories, but other prominent stories about Vicksburg in that ravine, and having them recall the feeling of what it was like of being submersed down in the ravine as a civilian or as a soldier. And so that's sort of where we are, and thank you for your time today. And I'm going to invite James, my partner on the exhibit design, to come up and talk about that, and we'll be back to take some questions.
Now?
Yeah. Oops. I hope I'm not. Oh, I'm still hot.
I've never heard an audience so excited to hear me speak up. So, my name is James Lyde. As Megan introduced me, I'm part of the Gallagher Associates team. We are the exhibit design firm. It's a great privilege to be part of the project. As Megan said, we've been involved in this project. The exhibits that this visitor center might look like. We are now in the midst of an initial concept phase to dig a little bit deeper, working with our good friends at Perkins&Will, trying to really kind of understand what visitors will actually see. What is the story? What are the stories they're going to encounter as they go through the exhibits? What does it look? What does it feel like? What are the kind of experiences? What do they touch? What do they hear? Those are the kinds of things that we've been working on to try to develop for the project. To give you a little idea, a basic introduction of who we are. As I said, we are people who do not know how to work a printer. Gallagher Associates. So, as I said, we're an exhibit design firm. We work on a wide range of different kinds of cultural institutions, some of which you may be familiar with. We work on a lot of social and cultural history projects. One of the ones we've done is the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, if anybody's familiar with that. We do a lot of work on musical and art kind of cultural institutions. One that's a little bit closer to home is the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, which is, I guess, just down the road a little east of us here. We work on a lot of natural history projects, work on sports and corporate projects. You see there's something we did for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum in Colorado Springs. And one of the sort of things, our kind of basic approach that we like to think about, is really kind of exploring ways that we can create beloved, iconic experiences for visitors. We want to create something that is completely unique to this place and this experience. That people are going to come to Vicksburg Visitor Centers, they're going to see something that they cannot see anywhere else. They're going to encounter stories that they may not have read about anywhere else, stories that aren't told in other places, and something that will be able to bring them back and make this a destination. So really kind of create something unique and valuable. So our basic philosophical approach is to take the experience we've had working on other projects and think about how we can create this tailored experience here at the Vicksburg site and really create something that's unique and wonderful. As we kind of explored our starting point for the process, we wanted to develop, as we were working with the team, working with Perkins&Will, working with the Friends of the Vicksburg, and working with the Mississippi Department of Arts, we wanted to explore some basic ideas, some basic approaches that sort of guide our interpretive approach and our design experience. And one of the things we landed on was really to look at this story as a set of interwoven experiences. That this is a story that involves not just the story of generals and military strategy. We need to tell that to visitors, right? That's part of what we need to provide visitors so they understand the context for what they will be seeing and looking at. But we really wanted to go deeper than that. We really wanted to explore this idea of really getting down and getting visitors to be able to encounter individual experiences of ordinary people that were swept up in these events. So what was it like to be a member of the 7th Texas Regiment that marched almost 200 miles across the hot countryside of Mississippi in May and then fought a pitched battle at Raymond against a much larger Union force? What was it like to be a civilian family that perhaps retreated and tried to find refuge from the advancing Union forces and retreated back and found refuge in Vicksburg and then got entrapped in a 47-day siege? You know, what was that like? You know, what are those accounts we can highlight? What was it like to be a former enslaved person that was freed during the Union occupation, then became enlisted in one of the Union colored troops and perhaps fought at the Battle of Milton's Bend, where the 9th Louisiana Regiment endured some of the highest casualties of any unit during the Civil War? So really kind of get that sense of diving down and looking at that individual experience. And that really forms the heart of what we want to show visitors. Another sort of essential idea that we really kind of developed is that we want to tell this full arc, the siege at Vicksburg, but as Megan said, that extended campaign that lasted for many months and crisscrossed back and forth across the Mississippi countryside and involved massive disruptions of the civilian population. We want to tell that story. We want to, of course, tell the story about the siege itself, which is an extremely dramatic moment, full of human pathos. We want to explore that kind of story. And then we want to tell the aftermath story. What was it like in Vicksburg during the military occupation that happened after the war? What happened during Reconstruction? So really kind of get visitors to that full arc of the story. So what I wanted to walk you through a little bit now is kind of explain what that visitor experience will be. What are they going to see? How are we breaking the story down? What are the parts of this kind of story? This is what we call a bubble plan or a visitor experience plan. don't think of this as an architectural layout. These aren't necessarily blocks of spaces, but it gives you a sense of the kind of orientation and the kind of the involvement of visitors to go through. So to kind of walk you through what that visitor experience will be. You'll see that as visitors come, and you heard Zena talk about that sort of grand experience as they come into the lobby and they get a sense of the kind of oriented. And when they kind of go into the actual visitor experience, the galleries themselves, we want to start with a series of orientation spaces that provide a very powerful, iconic moment where that really kind of gets to the heart of the story. We know that there are some people that will come to this museum and they will gallop through it. And they just will. There's some visitors that do that. They might only spend a half an hour here before they move on. And we want to make sure that if that's all they do, they're going to get the heart of the story. And that's what those orientation spaces will be able to do. There'll be other visitors that come through that will read every single label that's in there. And they may spend 3 or 4 hours in there. And we want to make sure that those kind of visitors really have an opportunity to enjoy the experience. We want to think about the diversity of different kinds of visitors, what they're motivated, what their learning styles are. Some people learn by reading. We want to have things that they can read. Some people learn by looking at things. We want to interlace media experiences that allow them to do that kind of thing. Some people are tactile learners. They want to touch something. They want to move something. We want to make sure that they have those kinds of experiences. So we think a lot about that sort of diversity of visitors and making sure that we're engaging all of them in the story. So as they come through, we'll get some kind of orientation. This first kind of beat of the story, that first chapter, that first gallery we're calling the pre-war Vicksburg story, that really sets the context for the overall experience. We want to explain to visitors what this place is, what life was like in antebellum society in Mississippi, give a sense of the diversity of the population that was there. There are stories of enslaved experiences, there are stories of civilian experiences, explain a little bit about why the city is here, because that's going to become a theme that ties through the rest of the story as we go through. As we move on to the next beat of the story, when we get to the actual campaign, again, this is a bigger story than just a siege. It's a story that begins late in 1862 and goes all the way through the middle of 1863, where you have this campaign, you have Union forces moving across the Mississippi countryside, you've got Confederate forces responding, there's a whole series of engagements. We want to tell that full arc of that story, explore all those kind of events as they kind of go through. That next beat of the story brings us to the siege itself, those 47 days where Confederate soldiers and civilians were trapped within the city, and what they endured, how those events unfolded, what actually happened, not just here in Vicksburg, but some of the other stories about other events that's happening around sort of broader city as we're trying to break the siege, and really kind of get them into that. This is a place where we can have lots of sort of immersive kind of experiences. Everybody's heard the story of the caves and how civilians try to find refuge in those caves. So what did that actually look like? What did that feel like? We can note for visitors, not just about what happened in Vicksburg in the months after the end of the siege when it was under Union occupation, explore the changes in society, what happened to the former enslaved population after they were found freedom, and then moving on into Reconstruction, the events that happened afterwards, how the city changed, how it didn't change, those kind of events, and kind of bring that all the way up into that sort of final note of how this story is remembered, how it was commemorated, kind of leading up to the actual formation of the battlefield site in the late 1800s. And that's an important part of the story. It's a continuing part of the story. It's part of why this story still matters to us today, why we still talk about it today. So getting visitors a sense, and that's the sort of arc of that story. Then as they leave, they come out, we'll have more exhibits there that help visitors orient themselves to what they can do next. I mean, we like to think about the visitor center as being a tool that interprets the largest, most important artifact that you have, which is the actual landscape itself. It's the site of this. So making sure visitors have the tools that they can use then to step out and explore not just the battlefield site, although we expect many visitors will do that, but hopefully be able to push them out to all these other sites we've talked about, Port Gibson and Raymond and all these other parts that are part of that campaign, to give them the tools that they have to be able to explore and drive themselves out further. So that's the kind of arc of that visitor experience. Those are the sort of pieces that they will see as they go through. And then it's really a matter of kind of opening us up for questions. We'd be very interested to hear from everybody if they have any thoughts about, in particular, are they specific stories that they want to see us explore in the exhibits? Are there certain things they want to see? Are there things they want to understand better? Are there things that they think that visitors would be helpful for visitors to be to explore? And that's the end of my presentation.
Here is one. I can frame it as a question, but it's really a thought. There was what they called contraband camps in Vicksburg, and I wondered about covering that. And there's some specific work about the experience of women immediately after the war who came to Vicksburg, both their experience in contraband camps and with the mass weddings of freed people. So I just wanted to raise that.
I think I can answer that. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Those are exactly the kinds of stories that we love. Again, those are stories that many people probably aren't familiar with. I mean, I certainly wasn't familiar before I started working on the project. And those are the kinds of stories that provide that human element that we think is so important for visitors to get from this. And it's the kind of stories that, honestly, you're not going to read about in most accounts. You're not going to read about that on Wikipedia. You're not really going to be able to get a sense of that. And those are the kinds of things that we can kind of bring in. What's great, in particular, if you have an account of a real person where you can tell their story and they can almost speak to visitors on that one-to-one level, and it gives you an entirely different perspective on the events that are happening here. And it creates that kind of emotional connection, what we call a real visceral connection with visitors. And that's the kind of thing that will leave them feeling impacted by coming to the site. That you know, our yardstick usually is not, we're never going to be able to tell the story of everything. No museum can do that. You just can't, right? What we want to do is inspire people and get them excited about those kinds of stories so they can go off and then start learning about themselves and digging deeper into it. And those are the kinds of stories that I think really inspire that emotion, that kind of connection.
I really enjoyed the presentation and looking forward to, if I'm still alive in 2028, seeing the place. But I want to know if y'all will be covering anything of, let's say, of the Sisters of Mercy who did a medical ministry during the actions in Vicksburg and whose work...
Thank you for that question. We have already found one artifact that talks about the Sisters of Mercy, and we are uncovering those stories right now. And Jeff Gambrone is our MDAH archivist and Civil War expert who is in the trenches, so to speak, in the archives digging through everything that we have that we can uncover on that story.
Just two items. You mentioned the U.S. colored troops, but are you addressing the fact that the slaves who were impressed to work on the fortifications, we'd have documents for that?
Absolutely.
And also in the aftermath, reconstruction, are you addressing the violence that happened in Vicksburg? That, you know, there were many federal investigations about the violence there.
Absolutely, we are. The National Park Service has a Mellon Fellow currently stationed in Vicksburg who is doing a lot of research on that front. and uncovering names of U.S. colored troops that were buried in the military park, the cemetery that's there, and she's doing groundbreaking research on behalf of the park that we will be able to utilize in the new center.
Thank you. Very informative presentation. I was just wondering, the Union Army and the grant is coming, the campaign is taking place, and you have slaves fighting for, some will be fighting for the Union, some will be fighting for the Confederacy, and slaves are, it's easy to distinguish the Confederate Army from the Union Army because some are in gray, some are in blue. But how are you able to distinguish which slaves are fighting for the Union and which slaves are fighting for the Confederacy? Is that possible to distinguish slaves that are fighting for either side?
Yes, we're going to use those personal stories to tell the whole context of what is happening during that time, and so we can definitely differentiate between who's fighting for which side at which point, but then what kind of pressures they might have on themselves to do that work.
So if I could just add a note to that. So the approach we like to really take is to allow these stories to speak for themselves. So as much as possible, and it's hard sometimes, you have to do a lot of work to find them, but that's what our task is to do that work, to find those individual accounts and allow them to speak to visitors directly as best we can. So that means we're not putting a curatorial layer on top of it. We're just letting those stories, those personal accounts, in their own words, explain what happened to them and why they did the things they did. And so that would be the approach that we'd like to take to really get that diversity of experiences that cut across.
I think it's important to note, too, that nearly all of the enslaved people who fought for the Confederacy were impressed to do so, and that's a story that we're looking at, we're doing research on, and we found the names and stories of some of those soldiers, some of whom are buried at Vicksburg. So that will absolutely be a part of the story that we're telling. And before we resume questions, we've just been joined by another very special guest, Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann. He is the leading force behind this project and has been since the beginning. He loves history. He knows the stories and the battlefield itself inside and out. And he early on had a real vision for the impact that this new visitor center can have for the state and the impact that it will have on telling this story that is central to American history. And so we are very grateful for his support for this project, for his strong and constant support for the Department of Archives and History and the two Mississippi museums.
All right, we're going to approve you, but
Would you like to say a word, Governor?
she's already got one voter.
Sometimes I have his vote.
Look, I want to take just a minute. I've been distributing the book, Battlefields of Mississippi. When I was growing up, long ago and far away, I thought every city had a battlefield around Vicksburg. Every city must have a battlefield. This is really cool. So I grew up literally in the battlefield in Vicksburg. Then when we left that and we started looking into other matters and the history of the state and how all of that, transpired and whatnot, it became clear to me that we had ignored Raymond, for example, where almost 1,000 men lost their lives, where they, 1st Tennessee lost about 2/3 of its membership. The Union came and the whole structure, and then how they proceeded. And as you know, the military aspects of General Grant's process through Mississippi is studied at West Point and all over the world about how he did that. So here we have, you know, Bruinsburg, the ships across, there was a Chickasaw Bayou battle that was the year before with Sherman, which is right outside the national park right now, the facilities there, which really is an integral part of this whole story that we have to tell. The first assaults on Vicksburg were actually the year before, and which ended up being repelled, and then this whole history. And if you read the accounts of the battle, you become just mesmerized how men were motivated to go hand-to-hand combat in May, in hot Mississippi, thirsty and all that other, over the issues that were of the day. So I just felt it was a phenomenal history that we could look back on. And then somehow Mark Keenum stole Grant's papers from Illinois and moved them to Mississippi State. Now, I assume they're not coming to get them back. You know, we got guards up there and everything, so I don't think they can get them. So now all of a sudden, we had Grant's papers in the state in which he probably had one of his greatest battles, and one of the greatest military battles and campaigns in the country. They were all right here. The thing that also motivated me is that people are not going to just drop in to Vicksburg. They're going to come from all over, and they're going to come down the Blues Trail, or they're going to come from Natchez, and they're going to come from wherever, come to this museum. And the fact that we could have our state exposed to these people with our historical work, as well as our new AWI, huge, largest in the country, system that's going in up in Madison County, just to let them explore Mississippi and how we're doing and what we're up to. I thought that was a great opportunity for the state. The location, the history of this quickly is that Bess White and Katie and Mayor Flaggs and several of them came to the office about 2 years ago and indicated that they wanted to get the federal government to build this, you know, to build a new interpretive center. The old center is very old, and the screens and everything are very bad. The exhibits are about like that right there. And the restrooms are horrible, and it mainly just used by people jogging in the park. So it's just really not very attractive. And so Kane Ditto had approached me about this about 3 years ago or 4 years ago about doing state funds. So they came to meet, and we sat down. They said we were going to go to the federal government. Well, my knowledge of the park helped us there some, because the federal government hadn't even repaired Union Avenue. It's sloughed in over there. In fact, part of the cemetery sloughed in. So we actually got deceased bones out waiting on the federal government. And I said, I just don't think that's the way to do that. What we need to do is have Mississippi build their own interpretive center. And so we had, and the state has been very gracious in committing $40 million to the project. And I think that's really important. That's a startup amount to be generated from these others. But what's really important is that we get people to come to Mississippi and see how we're progressing right now, viewed 100 years later. And when we talk with the architects about this, Mississippi is a big neighborhood, and we're a front porch neighborhood. And when you see the designs and the things that they're doing, the architects are doing, that's to exhibit our front porch, our openness that we have as a society to people coming, walking down the street and speaking to us. So we have an opportunity here for a national and international exhibit that has just been lying dormant while we went on to a lot of other things in our state. So now's the opportunity to do that. And this facility, we were kind enough to go up to Gettysburg, and it will be better than Gettysburg's facility when we get through with it, because who wants to be second? You know, we want to be first. So we want them to come down here and see how you did that. When we were in Gettysburg, they took us down into the secret part. You know, they got underneath there. We're not going to have that here because we've got climate control property here. But they took us to the secret part. You know, you have to leave your belt and your phone, you know, shoes and everything else to go in there. So we go in there and they said, look, what we want to do, show you all the exhibits that we've saved over the years about from the war and from this era. I said, that's really good. Do you have something that you could exhibit for us? So he said, yeah, just a minute. He goes back and he comes out with a little box. And he opens the box, and in it was a lock of Lincoln's hair that was cut off after he was shot in Ford's Theater. So they've got that in the basement of Gettysburg. So I volunteered Tate Reeves to cut a lock of his hair off and put it, not that there's anything going to happen to Tate, but maybe put it in the basement with, like they did Lincoln. I thought that would be appropriate. I think we have a unique opportunity here, historical opportunity. And I encourage you to read the book. I've gotten through most of it. I'm going back through the second part. But it describes the human element of the battles that went on here. Not just the strategic, but the actual suffering, hand-to-hand combat, look people in the eye, beat them off or stab them with a bayonet or beat them with the butt of a gun. And a lot of that went on here and in Vicksburg over a long siege. Our campaign is different from Hattiesburg, that 3-day battle that happened in Hattiesburg. Our campaign is different, and we ought to be different with what we show it, how we show it. And it needs to be comprehensive. Now, we had battles in Corinth, we had battles all over Mississippi, and even in Franklin, up in north, just north of here in Holmes County. So there's a lot to be told there, and we need to tell that story. And it needs to be told in a way that will bring people to Mississippi who will get to meet you, which is what we're trying to do. So anyway, very good history, very, very positive about what we're doing, very positive about having Katie and her group run it. They do a great job. And I think a couple of years from now, hopefully we'll be at a grand opening and celebrating what's going to be not only a historical site, but a national site for all of us. All right, it's good to see everybody, and thank y'all.
Like I said, he knows these stories and cares about them. Thank you, Governor, for your support and your leadership. And now more questions.
I'll catch y'all in the audience in just a second. Let me catch up on some of the ones that have come in through the live stream. Tony Gunter asks, with regard to aftermath, when you say it will cover through Reconstruction, what year specifically will it cover through?
So we're obviously still in the process of exploring that, but at the very least, it should go through the end of Reconstruction, 1877. But the way that we've been thinking about it now is it needs to go on beyond that. It really needs to kind of look all the way through well after that period, where you're starting to look at how the idea of the battle and the memory of the battle was commemorated and how that evolved and changed in the decades that followed. So our thought now is that it would actually lead all the way up, at the very least, until the formation of the park itself as a national battlefield in the late 1800s, but probably on afterwards as well, kind of looking through the post in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think when you leave that museum, you will want to come here and learn the rest of the story, and specifically the connections.
Gregory Bingham asks, remarks, when you mentioned that the interpretation begins in the autumn of 1862, the city was bombarded in the spring of that year. I don't understand why the spring is excluded.
Jeff, do you want to?
Yes, the campaign for Vicksburg in '62 did start in the spring, so it would have been under siege, or under bombardment from May of '62 went up through the end of the summer when the Union fleet had to withdraw because of the falling Mississippi River. So yeah, we are aware of that, and we will cover that entire '62 campaign for the city as well.
That's Jeff Gambrone, a longtime member of our staff who works in our Archives and Record Services division and is an expert on the Civil War story, the Vicksburg story, and is now helping us find artifacts that we need to purchase. to exhibit at Vicksburg, and he is absolutely critical to this project.
We have a question. Was there a branch of the Freedman Savings Bank in Vicksburg?
Yes, there was. In fact, the building it was headquartered in is still standing. But, yes, and those records have been digitized and they're available online for all the people that had accounts with the bank.
And then one last one. Aaron Rushing asks, what plans do you have for seeking local resources outside your own archives in order to get a more complete interpretation of the events that took place here?
Like artifacts and documents, we are wide open. We need more artifacts and documents. Y'all remember Charles Weeks, who was a researcher who did a lot of work here and left us a very generous bequest that is allowing us to purchase documents and artifacts to tell this story. We know that there are people who have artifacts and documents that we would love to have, and we would love to hear from you.
All right, one more question, the last one from the live stream. I'm going to have to put my cheaters back. Mark Carlson asks, what book is the Lieutenant Governor referring to? Title and author, please, if you're able.
It's called Battlefields of Mississippi. I believe the author was right. I have to check back again. It's available on Amazon under Battlefields of Mississippi. This guy, his name I think is Davis. This guy also wrote the Battlefields of Tennessee. So there are two books out there. One on the Civil War battlefields of Tennessee, one on Mississippi. I think it's about $17 or $18 or so. It's not very expensive. So you can get it off Amazon by typing in Battlefields of Mississippi.
You can get it, if not now, then soon you can get it at the museum store here.
Okay, maybe for the Lieutenant Governor too. Well, there are several sources. I'm pretty sure you're going to have something about Shelby Foote, you know, historian. But I was reading, maybe last week in the New York Times, where the author cited Black Reconstruction by Du Bois, 1935. I don't say I didn't admit that. Also reading about Charles Solace and Jane Logan about culture and change. That came out that the textbook commission of Mississippi have not acknowledged it. Now, how can you continue to keep our young people from understanding maybe a full history of what happened in Mississippi? Fuller has written, he's been one of our guests here, Jane Fuller, on Reconstruction. You cannot ignore those kind of people, so you cannot tell the whole truth.
Yeah, so just to quickly answer, so the approach we always take is we look at as wide variety of sources as possible. So those are exactly the kinds of things. I mean, you know, I'm sure Jeff can give us a long list of working bibliographies for all sorts of different things, and that's part of what we sort of drive, is try to make sure we capture all those perspectives, and that all becomes part of the story.
And you've heard me talk here before about the work that we're doing to uncover the local stories, the stories of enslaved people who may have worked at Windsor Ruins, served on both sides. There's one person in particular, and was killed and buried at Vicksburg. Michael Morris and Sarah Campbell and other people here at Archives and History are working very hard to uncover these stories, and we will be sharing them. So thank you for that.
This may be a little more process than anything substantive. I'm fascinated by having the designer, the architect. Ultimately, I'd love to hear a little bit about the kind of collection and research and investigation that has been initiated by the archives, by the designers, as part of the process that will result in this museum.
I think one of the strengths of this project, like with the two museums, is that we are a comprehensive historical agency. Jeff works in the archives division. Megan works in the museum division. We had people across the department participating and bringing different areas of expertise. I talked about the work that Michael Morris and Sarah Campbell are doing. We're having I mentioned already, an event in Port Gibson in a couple of weeks. We've done a lot of work in that region, uncovering the stories of the descendants of people who were involved in this story in one way or the other. And the Park Service and Bess, they've been doing this work for years too. So we are all sort of weaving together as many of these stories as we can find.
I'll add to that. Thank you for your question. We work very, very closely, of course, with archives and history and all of the people that are part of the owner's side. But from a designer's perspective, the research really never stops. We've actually had projects where there's been amazing content or collections or some artifact uncovered through the design process. And I think we have a very flexible process that allows for that on these types of projects. And of course, we work with our exhibit design partners that allow for that. There could be something amazing that happens and that we may have to address. And our process also is heavily steeped in research. So it's very, very difficult to approach any project with this sort of historical and contextual sensitivity with any preconceived notions. We have to sit back and take it all in. These great folks have decades of history that we have to absorb, and we're partnered with them so that we can absorb it at an instant as we need it. So it's really, really a great process, and I'm sure you have more to add.
I was just going to add one more quick note. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like Jeff just sent me this great thing this morning, literally, about, it was a link to some National Archives documents about the graves registration, and they're filled with these really poignant illustrations that people drew of as they were moving the bodies to the permanent location of the bed of them. These illustrations of the grave markers that would have been carved by the comrades of those who fell on both sides. And they're very, they're very moving. They're very touching, very poignant kinds of things. So the great thing about these kinds of projects is it drives us to find more of this, to find more of the work. The really challenging and frustrating thing is you can't show all of it, right? You have to go through some kind of process and pick. But in a way, that's okay, because I would think about the museum as not sort of like an ending note, right? Like we do all this work and it ends there. All the work that's happening, everything we develop, all the stories we hear that people have been sharing that will add to this, then become part of what can inform the programming activities of the museum. And you'll be seeing the results of this for years to come. That special programs or special events or learning opportunities. So it really is a way of, that's what I think the value of these cultural institutions are. It's in a way of starting that conversation and then providing the momentum so you can continue it forward.
Well, I know that Chris would ask for one more question, so.
Hi, that would be me. Thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question about the concept and kind of exhibition and related to your visitors for hands-on experimentation with children. Is that something that your concept is going to include, or is there a specific focus on how you're going to reach out to these school children and these ages with such, so many topics to cover, and kind of, if you have a second, talk about that.
Yeah, so I touched upon that very briefly when I was talking about how we think about learning styles and we think about the visitors that have different perspectives or are looking for different kinds of activities. It's something we look at and we check over and over again. And we always kind of go back to that principle of what's going to create the most impactful experience for visitors of all those different ages. And obviously kids are an important part of that. And so we actually do a lot of what we call user testing, particularly when we get to things like the media experience or an interactive experience that will engage children. And we actually, when we develop our concepts, we'll actually go test them with kids. Like we'll get some random kids and we'll have them do it. And do they find it interesting? Do they understand what we're doing? Are we pitching the message too high or too low? So we don't just rely on ourselves of coming up with the concept and then putting it in. We really want to make sure that visitors will actually get what we think they're going to get from it. So it's part of the process as we go through the many, many iterations.
We always say at Archives and History, we are here to serve everybody, all of you, but the school children are our most important constituents, and we will keep them front of mind in this project. Thank you all so much for coming today. We are really grateful to you, and thank you to our exhibit.
Thank you.